Greetings and hello. I'm Don Taylor from Main Street Middle School here in Montpelier and PLP Pathways, and welcome to the 10th episode of our PLP Pathways webinar series. I'd like to thank Oregon Media for letting us film the show in their studio.
Hi, I'm Maura Wheeler from Lamoille South Supervisory Union. Before we get into today's show, we want to make sure you know how to stay connected with our project at PLP Pathways. You can visit our site, follow us on Twitter, and keep tabs on the project through our blog. We'll show you these again at the end of the show.
Every month we'll be hosting a Google Hangout for Vermont educators, and today's pre-recorded segment will lead to online discussion, collaboration, and planning among interested educators, and videos are published on our PLP Pathways YouTube channel. We also have a website where we post lots of resources for you. So in our last session and webinar, we talked about the transitions for kids and how we can be supporting the transitions. And today is our last episode. This is our third season that we've done this, which is amazing that we've gotten to this point. And we always talk about evaluating our programs. And so tonight I'd like to talk a little bit about how teachers are reflecting on what they're doing and what teachers are doing to keep it fresh and new. We were just having a conversation about how it feels like the initial Act 77 enthusiasm has, maybe it's lost a little of that freshness and newness, and how are we going to keep that going in our classrooms? What's working, what's not working, and how can teachers really evaluate their own programs effectively moving forward? And so I guess my first question is, what do you think about that, and how are you encouraging the teachers you're working with to evaluate their programs?
Well, I think one of the key pieces all the time in teaching is to get feedback from kids. I think authentic youth-adult partnerships are so powerful, and they just increase engagement both for the kids and also for the adults that experience those partnerships. And so I think we're probably in our last week of school or last few weeks of school. And so while you have students available, reach out, build something to get some data or information from your students. Really find out, what did they like? What did they really not like? What was working for them? How would they change it if they were to do it again next year? If you're lucky enough to loop with your kids, I think it's even more valuable because you can start to really dream with your kids about what the potential changes are that you could make for the following school year. So I think that's one piece of it, really going to the student and asking for some of their voice in some of those pieces. And then one of the really wonderful things as a teacher is at the end of the year, just as we want students to be reflective, to really take some time with your team and be reflective. Really, maybe ask all the members of your team to answer a few questions or really think deeply about some of the things that went well. And just as we're teaching students to pause and reflect and be self-reflective, we really need to practice that as well. And so creating that space, it's so easy to go quickly right into summer, and we get caught up in the busyness of the adult world. And so it's so important to pause and do that reflective step.
And I totally agree with that, and I also believe that there's so many different ways that you can do that, either using Google Forms, which is super easy and simple. And I would also recommend that people who are getting feedback from kids, it often helps to ask the same questions, sometimes over time, so you can compare your data. And I also think this is something related to action research as well. You can ask these questions and get feedback, and then you can put that into action research for the future. And when I talked about venues or structures, again, you can do focus groups, you can do one-on-one interviews, you can have kids filling out surveys. But as you mentioned, I just think it's critical that when you have your kids, to be getting as much feedback from them as possible. And I think that getting that feedback is actually a cause and effect with adult relationships. The more feedback you get and the more you honor that feedback, I think the stronger your relationships with kids. And it's something that's terrifying at first maybe, but kids are so honest, and if you ask them and then you make adjustments based on their feedback, I think they develop a huge amount of respect. And that's a great way to develop those relationships. Now at your school, do you guys actually have any tool or any specific form that you're using to kind of evaluate PLPs, not only on teams but across the school?
We don't. That's an area that we're really looking at. I know over the next year we're going to really be looking at the different systems that we're using across our schools and across teams to really look at what our options are at a systems level for for how we implement our PLPs. And through that process, it will be an iterative process of receiving feedback to really strengthen our programming system-wide. So at the moment, we don't.
I think that's, we don't have a systemic way of doing that either, but that's something that teachers can also be leaders on, is, when you're talking to your colleagues, is say, hey, how are you evaluating your programs? And how are we meeting together to see what worked and what we could pull from other teams? And I also just want to point out that this is a great time of the year. If you're making plans for next year or evaluating your program, you could be doing that relative to, how many community partners did we have? Did we have flexible learning opportunities? Did we have community-based learning opportunities that were provided for all of our kids? And maybe reaching out to some of those community partners and saying, hey, what can we do to strengthen this relationship, or what can we do to have you in the classroom and start planning for next year? I mean, we want everybody to enjoy the summer, but it's a really good time to start planting the seeds for what you want to see down the road. And I guess just the last question I have is, you have an administrative role, and if you could, give people 3 tips about, what would you like to see people really focused on in your classrooms around PLPs? If you could, okay, at the end of the year I want you to evaluate, but I really want you to focus on these 3 areas. Are there recommendations that you can make?
That's a great question. So I think the first and foremost would always be that the student is at the center. So every decision that's made when we're thinking about planning and everything, that the student is at the center of all those things that are made. I also think having it be a part of a student's curriculum and daily experience. It's not an add-on. It's not a side thing. It's not something that you do for 20 minutes a day. That it's a living thing that really it really exists with the students in their school day and out of school as well. And then I think, just really thinking about how we can use this platform to help encourage students to find their voice and find their passion, and maybe think outside of the school day and really help connect them and start thinking about what comes next, whether that's high school or even thinking after they're done with school, but really thinking about how to develop those transferable skills and really start thinking about their future.
Those are great points, and I guess I would say, what are the questions we should be asking? So one question I would ask is, how is the PLP, what structures is our PLP and personalized learning woven into, like student conferences and parent communications, reaching out to the family. So what are the structures that we're weaving this into? And then just another question is, how is the PLP reflective of the transformation for the student? And is the PLP giving us evidence that they're ready for the next step? So looking at the PLPs and maybe even asking some high school folks to come in, or that next life and learning stage, to say, what are you seeing here that's good? What are you seeing that needs work? And what are the skills that we can be using or developing to make our kids even more prepared? So again, we're going to have a webinar, a Google Hangout about this on Thursday, June 7th. We'll be talking about how to evaluate your programs. And that'll wrap up our 3rd season of the PLP Pathways. I'd like to thank Maura, Adam Blair, who's our cinematographer, photographer, and also Orca Media, the Middle Grades Collaborative, and the Tarrant Institute for all their support. We have a lot of work still to do, but we appreciate anybody out there who's been following along, and to all the Vermont educators who are winding the year down. Thanks for all you do and all your hard work, and we'll see you next year. Thanks very much.